Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Dr. Regina Bradley, and this is Outkasted Conversations. It's bad. I have to think about this. Number 34. So in the building, we have the fabulous and one of the comic studies extraordinaire, Dr. Qiana Whitted, associate professor at University of South Carolina in Columbia. How you doing this afternoon, Dr. Whitted? How you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. You see, I got to be on the low because I'm running from the library popo for using this group study.
You can whisper.
It's real. The struggle is real to be smart. But anyway, you know what you have to do to get into the club. How did you become outcasted?
Okay, so how did I become outcasted? For me, I would have to say Aquemini is my favorite album, the one I listened to from song beginning to end. But Outkast first came to my attention through AT Aliens, which sort of debuted after I graduated from college. So I got my BA from Hampton University, and I was going to grad school. And their album is what carried me as I went all the way up the East Coast to Connecticut, to New Haven, to go to Yale. And so I sort of considered myself to be a Virginia girl, a Southern girl, and here I was in this other space. The people sounded different. Everybody seemed to act different. I didn't know if I fit in addition to all the intellectual anxieties, there was everything else. So for me, Outkast was sort of this little bit of home that I could hang on to when I was playing their CD driving around Connecticut. And if you've ever been, up north, on the radio, if they're not from New York or New Jersey, they're not playing it. So I was, it was something that, it was a bit of nostalgia for me, even though I didn't come from the same place they did, and I kind of sort of hung on to it for that reason. And then later I moved to Atlanta for a few years when I was writing my dissertation after I got married. So that's when Aquemini came out. So by then I had already been well acquainted.
Well, no, I think that Aquemini, I don't know, I feel like I cheat between Aquemini and AT Aliens, but Aquemini is always at the top of the list for me. But it's kind of dope. So you were talking about AT Aliens, and I actually want to start our conversation there. You do comic book studies, which sounds extremely sexy for the Academy. Um, but for the folks who might not be acquainted with what that means, can you give us a little bit of definition of what comic studies is and why it's significant and all that other good stuff?
Well, I mean, I got my start studying African American literature and cultural studies, but I was always a comic book reader. And the more that I got into sort of doing both, teaching both, I tried to figure out ways to bring the two together. And I realized that there is this whole field of study, widely interdisciplinary. There are people who have literature backgrounds like myself, art departments, linguistics, different types of history and cultural studies, who all sort of focus on this medium, on this form, and how it works, and the different interplay of visual, verbal elements, and how the medium is sort of used to tell stories. So it's a different sort of platform for storytelling, and that's what I do now. I sort of, most of my work focuses on intersections of race and history and
Mm-hmm.
comic books.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's awesome. So here at Outcasted Conversations, we're equal opportunity haters on everything. But no, because I was thinking when I was inviting you for the project, I was thinking about your comic studies and how it can relate to AT Aliens, right? Because AT Aliens really came up with some innovative ways to think about this idea of otherness and Southern experiences using the comic book form. So you have the AT Aliens liner notes slash comic, right? It wasn't the best comic. As much as I loved them, it wasn't the best comic. So could you give us a couple of thoughts on what you thought about, the concept and why it was significant and how we, renegotiate what Southernness and Blackness means in this particular moment?
Well, I have to say, when I looked back at the conversation between you and our friend John Jennings, I was relieved to see that you all felt the same way about the comic that I did, because I thought, ooh, when I read it again, I mean, it's a fun idea. It's a strange story, not the easiest to follow, and the art could be a little stronger. But I mean, I like the idea, and I like the way they sort of introduce themselves in this album through the comic. I haven't had a chance to get my hands on the other OutKast comic that you all were talking about. But in terms of this one, I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting is that comics and hip hop already have a sort of strong and conflicted relationship. Since the beginning of hip hop, you know, there are rappers who are going up against Superman and people who are naming themselves after Marvel characters. So, I mean, that's not new necessarily. You have people like Wu-Tang, who sort of, their aesthetic sort of includes comics and anime, or MF Doom, and DMC from Rum DMC is having his own comic that's coming out soon, and Ed Piscor's Hip Hop Family Tree is sort of archiving hip hop through comics form. So all of that is to say, you know, they're pulling on a larger sort of tradition here. But at the same time, I think what was interesting when I looked at it again recently was sort of what choices they make and sort of what's not here. So, for instance, you know, in Method Man's comic, and then some of the others, you know, you're going to have a lot of the sort of superhero tropes, right? And although Dre and Big Boy are heroes in this, and they have powers, they're not exactly like Cape Crusaders. They're not trying to. They're wearing their same clothes. I can look at the cover here, and they're wearing his varsity jacket or whatever. There's a prophecy and all of that, but I mean, it doesn't follow sort of that traditional format. It also doesn't have the kind of urban landscapes that you will find in some of the other hip-hop comics collaborations. So we have a lot of New York rappers that might repurpose Metropolis or Gotham for them. And Atlanta is a city, too, so they could have done that, but they don't, right? So I think about that. The other thing is, you know, like Dwayne McDuffie and Icon, they could have taken their alien and have him crash landed in a southern plantation during slavery. But they chose not to do that either, right? So they didn't use that as their kind of origin story. Instead, they try to look for a third space, and in this case, it's outer space. And they repurpose that for their story about their identity and their origins. And, you know, it says #1, so it's sort of getting things started, introducing them to the public. So, I mean, I think that's interesting. So they're kind of following in this tradition of hip-hop and comics, but they're doing something new with it. I can't really tell if, I mean, there's Atlantis in here, which could be underwater or space. I don't quite know. And they relocate Savannah somewhere. That's cool. And it's interesting. I mean, all of the familiar comic book superhero, some of those elements are there, but I think some of the changes that they make can tell us a lot too.
I mean, I think that's important also because, you know, AT Aliens came out right after their diss at the Source Awards, you know what I'm saying? So it was like this pushback against being othered, because that was some of the things I was thinking about when I was looking at the comic too, like the idea that you have these mobile southern spaces, right? Like Savannah's not in Savannah per se, it's somewhere. And then, you know, the idea of Atlantis and like the mystique at the time of southern landscapes, especially, you know, Atlanta was on the cusp of becoming this international city because they had just, you know, were about to do the Olympics or whatever. But it was like, you know, thinking about these multiple ideas of southernness and origin stories I thought was really important because oftentimes when you think about superhero comics, there has to have something had to happen for you to get the superhero, right? And the villain in the comic was like Nosamuli or Nasamuli or something like that. I thought that was a pushback against, you know, hip hop as an origin point. So, you know, like when we think about hip hop, we think about a particular type of origin story. We think about the Bronx. We think about New York. And it was like, you know, you have this evil musical something or another.
I thought it was like if you spell it backwards, I thought it spelled something, but I mean, he was against evil and censorship. So, I mean, there's like some industry stuff there too, right?
Yeah, the idea that they're not even accepted in hip hop, right? I think is a big underlying factor. If you want to play around, I tried to play around with No Salui and see what it spelled out. Maybe Illuminati something or
Yeah, that's
another.
what I was thinking. I thought illumination something. Yeah.
It's something, right? But I really like your work because it makes us reconsider what some of these things mean. And I know your book, not your edited book on comic studies, but your book looks at ideas of utopia, and what utopia means for Black folks. So could you tell us a little bit about your book and how you're defining this idea of utopia?
So this one you're talking about the Problem of Evil book?
Mm-hmm.
That's what you're referring to? Okay, so, well, that one actually, I sort of take as my starting place some of the ideas about religion and spirituality that circulate in African American history and traditions, sort of related to communities of faith and belief. But then I look at a number of African American writers who offer sort of creative expressions of dissent and protest against that. So in that respect, you could say they are pushing back against or rejecting a particular kind of utopian space,
Mm-hmm.
kind of religious otherworldly space for another. And it's a more earthbound, humanist reality often for writers like Alice Walker and Color Purple or James Baldwin, or I look at some Richard Wright, Nella Larson. So I look at sort of 20th century writers who are playing around with that idea. And I think particularly when you're dealing with the South, you see the pushback and the conflict more prominently in literature between generations, young and old, but also along gender and class lines as well. And I think what we see in the literature, at least, is that all types of people, old or young, can still sort of express these doubts and problems with the church and look for and aspire to another type of space. There are a lot of Black arts movement writers, for instance, like Carolyn Rogers, who do this too. And in response, someone like Carolyn Rogers tries to reclaim what was for her countercultural music at the time, jazz, as her Bible. And so I guess you could, thinking about some of the work you've done on OutKast, you could look at their music in that way. Even thinking about me talking about going up to Connecticut and playing this CD in my car, is creating a kind of utopian space in the midst of an environment that feels very unwelcoming, right? And I feel like they try to do that by putting something like Savannah in this comic alongside Atlantis, in this interesting comic in this strange way.
Yeah, I mean, another thing I was thinking about too is elevators, like the video for elevators. And you kind of have like these folks are on this hunt. They look like they're like from the CDC. It's kind of messed up to look at it, especially with the Ebola scare that's going on right now, because it's it's like an overlap almost, right? Like you're looking for these kind of othered bodies, spaces. They have like the heat-seeking stuff. So, like, for example, when Andre puts his hand on a branch or something in the woods, you don't see it; it's invisible. But then when I guess the alien hunters or whatever come, you see like this outline of the handprint. I just think it's really interesting how these kind of comic spaces, especially when you're talking about the South, you know what I'm saying? Because oftentimes it's so difficult to remove the South from these traditional narratives of the Black church and redemption and trauma without thinking about how significant that is to how we understand whatever, right? Whether it's Black identity and everything like that, and really kind of playing around with that and making people uncomfortable with it, right? Like this idea, like you have people among you that you don't really know where their origin points are.
Right.
Is really important. And then also, kind of slightly shifting gears and continuing this conversation about Southernness as this kind of comic space. I'm thinking about Jeremy Love's Bayou, for example, which I'm still so in love with. And using visual culture to, redefine what race looks like in these otherwise stagnant spaces or seemingly stagnant spaces in the South. What are some of your thoughts on the role of comics in doing that?
Well, so in the book that I did edit, the one on comics in the U.S. South, we talk a lot about how the South appears in comics, and we try to make the case that while many might want to associate the South as having a kind of, and this we can say South plural, as an oral culture, that it's also deeply and heavily visual too. We forget that. And when you look at a comic like Incognito, for instance, that's about passing, you can't forget it. But you also can't forget it when you look at something like Jeremy Loves Bayou, which sort of takes history in this fictional Mississippi town in the 30s as it's often remembered, and then transforms it using its own mythologies and its own legends and into a place where the people in the stories have greater degrees of agency and fluidity, where they can move between worlds, where the people who are dead don't stay dead and can help others. I mean, I think it's important in the comic, well, not just in the comic, OutKast, but in their songs, they don't just refer to themselves as AT-aliens, but also AT-alienators.
Mm-hmm.
That says something, too, because it puts them in a heroic stance where they're trying to say, you know, we're also making these decisions about...
Voluntarily.
Right, about who belongs in this space or not. And so I see them doing some of that same sort of repurposing work as well. I mean, they're drawing on so many different tropes and intertextual references, and hip-hop already does that, but so do comics. And they're blending them together. I mean, I didn't even get all the references in the comic, and I'm sure there's things that went over my head. But yeah, so something like Jeremy's Bayou does that too, sort of trading in these postmodern types of pastiche and intertextual references that make for, you know, a good hip-hop song that draws on a knowing audience, but also turns it and remixes what they know into something new.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I would make that connection, yeah.
I think that's dope. So tell the people what you're working on, how they can get in contact with you, all that good stuff.
What am I working on? So right now I am spending a lot of time in the 1950s. I'm doing some work still on race and history and comics, but mostly transported back to some earlier Golden Age comics. So that's what I'm working on right now. And how to reach me? I blog every once in a while at the Hooded Utilitarian, and I throw some crazy posts up there, so you can come and talk to me there, or at University of South Carolina, my last name Whitted at sc.edu.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us for this episode. This was dope. I had a really good time and got some things thinking, especially when you were talking about Bayou. That's some real awesome stuff. So thank you, Dr. Whitted. We appreciate you.
Thank you. This is great.
Yeah, no problem. I'm Dr. Regina Bradley. This is Outkasted Conversations. We'll holler at y'all next week. Y'all be easy.